By the time the Messerschmitt Me 262 entered limited combat service in the summer of 1944, it represented a technological leap so significant that Allied intelligence officers who first encountered it struggled to categorize what they were looking at. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines rather than a conventional piston engine and propeller, the Me 262 could reach speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour in level flight, roughly 100 miles per hour, faster than the best piston engine fighters the Allies could put into the air, including the American P-51 Mustang and the British Spitfire's late-war variants. Against conventional fighters, the Me-262 possessed such a decisive speed advantage that Allied pilots frequently had no viable tactic beyond attempting to catch the jet on the ground or during its comparatively vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, since Me-262 pilots who chose to disengage in level flight could simply outrun any pursuing aircraft. The aircraft's development trajectory, however, tells a story considerably more complicated than pure engineering triumph. German jet engine research had been underway since the mid-1930s, and a working prototype of the Me-262 airframe had achieved its first flight under jet power in July 1942, nearly 2 full years before the aircraft saw meaningful combat deployment. This delay, and the reasons behind it, would ultimately determine whether an aircraft with the potential to fundamentally alter the air war over Europe arrived in time to do so, or arrived too late and in too limited numbers to change an outcome that German military leadership, by 1944, could no longer meaningfully influence through any single weapons program. Historical accounts have long debated precisely how much responsibility rests with a single, well-documented intervention by Adolf Hitler in the Me-262's development timeline. But the broader pattern of delay is not in serious dispute. In May 1943, when shown the Me-262 prototype and briefed on its capabilities as an interceptor aircraft, Hitler instead ordered that the design be adapted to serve as a fast bomber, a role for which the airframe had never been optimized and which required significant engineering modifications to accommodate bomb racks and a bombing role the aircraft's designers had not originally intended. This decision, formalized in subsequent directives throughout 1943 and early 1944, diverted engineering resources away from refining the aircraft's fighter capabilities and toward a bomber, conversion that production and operational experience would later demonstrate added little practical value, given the aircraft's limited bomb capacity and the German military's already collapsing ability to conduct offensive bombing operations against Allied territory by 1944. Beyond this single command decision, the Me-262 program faced a cascading series of institutional and industrial obstacles that proved, in aggregate, at least as consequential as any individual directive. The Jumo 004 engines that powered the aircraft required materials, particularly high-temperature-resistant metal alloys for turbine components, that Germany's wartime economy, increasingly strangled by Allied strategic bombing and resource shortages, struggled to produce in sufficient quality and quantity. Engine reliability remained a persistent and serious problem throughout the aircraft's operational life, with early production Jumo 004 engines requiring complete overhaul after as few as 10 to 25 flight hours, a service interval that would have been considered entirely unacceptable for any conventional piston aircraft engine of the period, and which significantly constrained the operational tempo German jet squadrons could sustain even once aircraft became available in meaningful numbers. By the time large-scale Me-262 production began in earnest during the second half of 1944, German industrial capacity was operating under conditions that would have made rapid, large-scale manufacturing of any advanced weapons system extraordinarily difficult, regardless of the underlying design's merit. Allied strategic bombing campaigns had specifically targeted German aircraft production facilities, and, critically, the synthetic fuel plants that supplied aviation fuel to the Luftwaffe, creating a fuel shortage crisis that meant even completed Me-262 airframes frequently sat idle on airfields for want of sufficient fuel to conduct training flights, let alone sustained combat operations. Production of the aircraft was dispersed across numerous smaller facilities, including underground and forest-camouflaged assembly sites, in an effort to evade Allied bombing raids targeting centralized aircraft manufacturing, a dispersal strategy that succeeded in preserving some production capacity, but at a significant cost to manufacturing efficiency and quality control consistency. German aircraft factories producing Me-262 components, like much of German wartime industrial production by this stage of the conflict, increasingly relied on forced and slave labor drawn from concentration camps and occupied territories, a grim industrial reality that extended across much of Germany's late-war weapons production, and that historians have documented in connection with several Me-262 production facilities, including underground manufacturing sites where prisoners worked under conditions similar to those documented at other German wartime armaments facilities. Despite these enormous obstacles, German industry ultimately produced approximately 1,400 Me-262 airframes before the war's end, though historians estimate that only a fraction of these aircraft, likely fewer than 300, ever became operational in frontline combat units, with the remainder lost to production delays, fuel shortages, pilot training bottlenecks, and the accelerating collapse of German infrastructure during the war's final months. If the story of technology arriving at the wrong moment in history interests the viewer, remember to subscribe. Every week, this series traces the machines that shaped, or nearly shaped, the outcome of the 20th century's defining conflicts. The Me-262's first confirmed combat engagements occurred in the summer of 1944, and Allied air forces recognized almost immediately that the aircraft represented a categorically different threat than any German fighter previously encountered. Allied bomber crews and escort fighter pilots developed new tactical doctrines specifically in response to the jet's introduction, emphasizing tight formation flying to concentrate defensive firepower, and, more significantly, deliberately targeting German airfields where Me-262 units were based, recognizing that the aircraft was considerably more vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when its jet engines produced comparatively sluggish acceleration relative to piston engine aircraft at low speed than during sustained high-altitude combat, where its speed advantage proved almost insurmountable for conventional Allied fighters. This tactical vulnerability during takeoff and landing became the primary avenue through which Allied forces neutralized the Me-262 threat, with specialized Allied fighter patrols specifically assigned to loiter near known German jet airfields, waiting to attack Me-262s during their most exposed operational moments, rather than attempting to engage the aircraft in the air-to-air combat conditions where its speed made interception nearly impossible. German jet units, recognizing this vulnerability, developed countermeasures including dedicated piston-engine fighter escorts, assigned specifically to protect Me-262 aircraft during takeoff and landing phases, an unusual tactical inversion in which conventional, technologically inferior aircraft were tasked with protecting a more advanced aircraft during its most vulnerable moments, rather than the reverse arrangement that air combat doctrine had traditionally assumed. The relatively small number of German pilots who flew the Me-262 in combat, drawn increasingly from an already depleted pool of experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots, as Germany's overall pilot training capacity collapsed under the strain of years of attrition warfare, achieved a combat record that, on a purely statistical basis, remains striking even amid the chaotic final months of the European air war. Individual Me-262 pilots and units claimed substantial numbers of Allied bomber and fighter kills relative to the small number of aircraft actually flying combat missions at any given time, with several pilots achieving jet-specific kill totals that established them among the most successful fighter pilots of the war's final year. Though historians caution that claimed kill figures from this chaotic period require careful verification against Allied loss records, which frequently show somewhat lower confirmed losses than corresponding German claims. Yet these tactical successes, however statistically impressive in isolation, occurred within a strategic context that had already been decided by early 1945. Regardless of any single weapon system's individual performance, Germany's overall war effort by this point faced collapsing fuel production, a devastated industrial base, an exhausted and depleted pilot corps, and advancing Allied and Soviet ground forces converging from multiple directions on German territory. The Me-262, however technically superior to any conventional Allied fighter, existed in numbers and operational conditions that made it fundamentally incapable of altering this broader strategic trajectory. A technological marvel deployed within a military and industrial system that had already lost the capacity to translate individual tactical advantages into meaningful strategic outcomes. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender in May 1945, both American and Soviet forces moved rapidly to secure surviving M262 airframes, technical documentation, and, where possible, the German engineers and technicians responsible for the aircraft's jet propulsion technology. Recognizing that Germany had achieved a level of practical jet engine development that neither Allied power had yet matched in operational combat aircraft, American forces captured a substantial number of intact or repairable M262 airframes and transported several back to the United States for detailed technical evaluation, testing, and, in a small number of cases, active flight evaluation programs that directly informed subsequent American jet fighter development throughout the late 1940s, the technical lineage connecting German wartime jet engine research to post-war American and Soviet jet aircraft. Development remains a subject of ongoing historical documentation, running parallel to the more publicly known story of German rocket engineers recruited under Operation Paperclip, though the jet propulsion engineers and technical documentation captured alongside Me-262 airframes followed a somewhat less centralized and less individually celebrated path into American and Soviet post-war aviation industry than their rocket engineering counterparts. Nonetheless, design principles and practical engineering lessons drawn directly from captured Me-262 aircraft and associated technical documentation measurably influenced early post-war jet fighter programs in both the United States and the Soviet Union, representing another instance in which German wartime technological achievement, arriving too late to affect the war's outcome, nonetheless directly shaped the technological trajectory of the Cold War that followed. The Me-262's historical significance rests almost entirely on this fundamental tension between individual technical brilliance and catastrophic strategic timing. As a piece of engineering, the aircraft represented a genuine and substantial leap forward, embodying design principles, including its swept-wing configuration and twin-engine jet propulsion architecture, that would directly influence fighter aircraft design for decades following the war's conclusion. As a weapon deployed within an actual military campaign, however, the Me-262 arrived roughly 2 years later than its underlying technology could plausibly have allowed, constrained first by a strategically questionable command decision to prioritize a bomber variant over the aircraft's core fighter capability, and subsequently by an industrial and logistical collapse that no individual weapons program, however advanced, could have overcome. What remains today, in the small number of preserved Me-262 airframes displayed in museums across the world, is a machine whose combat record cannot be fully separated from the questions of what might have occurred had its development followed a different, less encumbered trajectory beginning in 1942 rather than reaching meaningful operational numbers only in the war's final desperate months. The aircraft's technical achievement is not in serious historical dispute. Its strategic irrelevance to the war's actual outcome is equally well established. Between these two facts lies the Me-262's enduring historical significance, a demonstration that technological superiority, however genuine, cannot by itself overcome the industrial, logistical, and strategic collapse of the system responsible for producing and deploying it. a lesson that later military planners across multiple nations would study closely in the decades of the Cold War that followed. Viewers interested in this story of advanced wartime technology arriving too late to change history are directed to a related story, how a small group of engineers kept Britain's Avro Vulcan flying decades after its own military relevance had faded. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.